Hey everyone. So I'm going to read an email that I got recently from a woman named Brittany who asked me a question specifically about submission and what that looks like relative to being a doormat. And I'll explain what I mean in a minute. This is not the first time I've had a question essentially asking me, okay, so Suzanne, you help women become less argumentative and difficult, less like the modern woman, in other words, and more about getting in touch with their feminine side to speak to a man. But what if you're dealing with a man who's controlling or abusive, essentially? What do you tell the women with respect to your teachings in that case? So here's this particular email from this gal. Hi, Suzanne. I've recently ended a toxic relationship, and I'm now wondering more than ever what it means to balance being a submissive woman while not being a doormat. I'm 22 and my ex is 34. He's a red-pilled man while I consider myself a more progressive woman with a traditional twist. A key component in our relationship was that no topic was out of bounds. We boldly discussed everything from religion, politics, aliens, racism, conspiracy theories, war, and especially modern dating/gender dynamics. Although we had completely different views, he admired the fact that I could hold an intellectual conversation with him until he didn't. I'd never shout, curse, or disrespect him. I was cautious with my tone and made sure I listened intensely before responding. I'd approach each conversation with the intent to learn, inform, and to have an exchange of ideas. He did not hold that same regard for me. He not only started to ridicule my ideas, but started to get verbally violent with me. He cursed me out like a dog and talked to me like a child whenever he became upset. I made a conscious effort to hold my tongue while he told me on multiple occasions how he didn't care how he made me feel. One of the last things he told me was that I was argumentative, aggressive with him, and disagreeable. Whenever I'd have a different opinion from what he said, he cussed me out and gave me the silent treatment. When I'd come to him to tell him I don't like being cussed at, he would accuse me of trying to start shit, quote unquote, and told me the way he treated me was justified, and so on and so forth. There's a little bit more, but you got the gist of it. Okay, so I wanted to address this by doing something I probably should have done a while ago. I've never really used the word submission in my work for obvious reasons. It's a very loaded term. So the first thing I want to do is just explain what it really means to be, quote unquote, submissive in a relationship with a man. All it means is to be willing to yield or to bend to someone else's ideas or suggestions and not have everything your way all the time. At least that's all I mean by it. The problem is with the submission concept is that it's layered with a lot of depth and nuance. I mean, too many people think of it as being, you're supposed to kowtow to somebody's will all the time and do whatever they say and have no opinion about it. So let me tell you what submission, now that I've defined it, at least by the way I mean it when I talk to women about this, although again, I don't really ever use the word submission. Here's what submission is not. It is not being a doormat. It is not never sharing your opinion. It is definitely not saying nothing when you're being treated poorly. So at the end of the day, only you in your relationship can determine whether or not the person to whom you're married or in a relationship with is someone worthy of, quote unquote, submitting to, if you want to use that word. Here is when to submit and when not to. When there's mutual respect between two parties. B, if you're married to a fundamentally good man. And you know whether you're married to a good man. Most people know that. It's very obvious in the way they were raised, in the way they talk to you, in the way they treat other people, in the way they treat women in particular. Clearly, everything that this woman's explaining in this email, that is not a good man. That you're basically dealing with a boy in a man's body. Any man who would talk in the way that she's saying he talks to her or calls you names, that's a really obvious one. You never accept any verbal abuse from anybody. You're not dealing with a good man if you're dealing with somebody who verbally abuses you. So that's a big tip-off. The moment if he's ever calling you names or being, as we say, verbally abusive, then you're not dealing with a quote unquote good man. And that's not someone to whom you should be submitting. You have to be careful, though, with the verbal abuse thing because, unfortunately, a lot of women confuse verbal abuse with emotional abuse because, again, that's a very slippery slope. It's very easy to make accusations of narcissism and gaslighting. Those are really famous words that we use today. We throw around a lot. Let's put it that way. It's not that you can't be dealing with that. It's that you have to be very careful about to whom you're ascribing those terms. It can be true or it cannot be true. It's very easy, especially today with the culture that we live in, where anytime somebody says something you don't agree with, you're told that you're being abused, which is just crap. That isn't true. So you have to really get help from a professional if you think you're dealing with narcissistic type behaviors. I have seen this in my coaching practice, and if I think I'm dealing with something outside of my scope of expertise, I move them on to somebody else, who can help in that domain. But I have to say that in all the coaching I've done, I can only think of 2 scenarios, maybe 3, where it was reversed like that, where the women really were putting into action what I was suggesting, and it was not, working, if you want to say that, with their particular husbands because they were dealing with somebody who should not be submitted to because he's got a lot of problems of his own that he hasn't worked out. And you can tell that by, I think this person said that this gentleman was red-pilled. You really want to stay away from the red-pilled men, not because they're bad people, but because if you're a marriage-minded woman who wants a relationship that is going to become marriage, the red-pilled men are not your folks because they're off of marriage. They've decided to turn away from that. And so there's not going to be a meeting of the minds there. So at the end of the day, when I talk about submission, and again, I don't use that word because it's so loaded that I think it's confusing for people. I always frame things with respect to just how do you want to behave with another human in a way that gets that person to respond to you. I'm much more interested in the Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People type strategy in working with people. And my point in talking with women about it is because they're told that if you're ever, listen to a man, for example, that you're somehow weak or letting him win and you're supposed to stand your ground. Those are the things I'm fighting against. I'm trying to explain the difference between these cultural messages that you've been taught to believe and what really works in a relationship with a man. So it sounds like submission sometimes, a lot of what I talk about, and that's why I'm addressing this, because in no way, shape, or form, if you're dealing with a man who is not good, or is in any way abusive, should you ever be putting into action the things that I teach. And I actually, in the Alpha Females Guidebook, have a caveat at the beginning of that book saying that very thing. So just wanted to jump on here and clarify that specifically for this gal, Brittany, who wrote the email, but for anybody else who's asked me to address this concept and explain it further. So I hope that